Welcome to the Recovery 2.0 conference. I'm your host, Tommy Rosen, and today I am excited as usual to speak with Dr. Gabor Maté. Dr. Maté is a well-known medical doctor, author, celebrated keynote speaker at conferences across the world. He is internationally known for his work on mind-body unity in health and illness, on attention deficit disorder, and for his breakthrough analysis of addiction as a psychophysiological response to childhood trauma and emotional loss. Dr. Maté, Gabor, thank you so much for lending your spirit and voice to Recovery 2.0 once again. Welcome.
Hey, Tommy, I wouldn't miss it. Thank you.
So I want to talk about this book, The Myth of Normal. It's right there, that first part of the title is of great interest to me. If you could speak about how you came upon that topic, that title for this book.
The Myth of Normal. So it has a number of implications. One is that there's an idea in our society that there's the troubled, insane, mentally ill ones, and there's the rest of us who are normal. And so then, you either meet the criteria of some diagnosis in the DSM, which is the Psychiatric Bible of Diagnosis, or you don't. And if you don't meet the criteria, then you're mentally well. If you do meet it, then I have this cat that keeps wanting to jump on my table. If you don't meet the criteria, then you're well. And if you meet the criteria, then you have a mental illness. There's the normal ones, then there's the ill ones. Whereas it's just not reality. It's not how I see it, but it's also not reality. What I'm saying is that there's actually a spectrum. As with addictions, there's people who are at one end of the spectrum, other people, very few who have no addiction at all. And there's a vast majority of people who do have some addiction that does have a negative impact in their lives. And it's not a question of there's the abnormal ones and the normal ones. In fact, what I'm saying is that in our culture, addiction is the norm.
Yes.
So to call it a pathology or an abnormality is missing the point. It's the same way with depression or anxiety or other mental health disorder. And similarly with physical diseases. People have a whole range of symptoms, and sometimes the symptoms get severe enough that they qualify for particular diagnosis, but it's not like everybody else is healthy. So that's the first meaning, is that everything is on a spectrum, and rather than for the abnormality in one person and thinking that the rest of us are healthy, really, what is normal in our society is what is the norm is some degree of non-well-being. Mentally or physically.
Yes. I've heard it said by a spiritual teacher of mine that with the drinking of alcohol, for example, it's so accepted as a way of passing time or as a way of navigating challenge or just as a way of just enjoying yourself, that if you were to go outside and it's as if you wake up one day with 102 or 103 temperature. Yeah. And you go outside and you say to people, I have 102 degree temperature, and everybody you speak to says, well, so do I. What's the problem with that?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And there's a great quote by Aldous Huxley that I'm actually wanting to bring up on my computer here so I can read it to you. It's from Brave New World Revisited. And he says, the real hopeless victims of mental illness are to be found among those who appear to be most normal. Many of them are normal because they are so well adjusted to our mode of existence, because their human voice has been silenced so early in their lives that they do not even struggle or suffer or develop symptoms as the neurotic does. They are normal not in what may be called the absolute sense of the word. They are normal only in relation to a profoundly abnormal society. And so that's the second meaning of the book, which is that, the title, which is that, what is the norm defined in relationship to, and are we living in a normal society? So if you look at the statistics, more and more kids are being diagnosed with anxiety, with ADHD, with depression. More and more people are on medications. The average American is 50% of Americans, 50 to 70% of Americans actually are on at least one medication as adults. So that's the norm. Well, yeah, at some point you have to ask, well, what's the nature of a society that produces illness on such a massive scale?
Mm. Mm.
And then the third meaning is that if we define the norm as what everybody else does, or what the average does, just as what your teacher said, then you might say that if everybody in Los Angeles, which is where you live, tortured their cats, then not torturing your cat would make you abnormal. But is torturing your cat normal in the absolute human sense?
Mm.
Well, no, it isn't. It's an aberration. It's an aggression. It's a pathology.
Mm.
And so we can relate the normal to the statistical norm in a particular culture, or we can relate it to actual human needs and deep human experience of human nature.
Mm.
What I'm saying is that what is considered to be normal in our society is actually abnormal in relationship to genuine human needs and genuine human nature.
Mm. Thank you.
Yeah, so those are the meanings of the myth of normal.
Mm. I'm reflecting back on certain childhood experiences that I had, either in my family or in a school setting, where growing up, I'm thinking to myself, not consciously, of course, but I'm trying to fit in. I'm trying to be a part of.
Yeah.
The things that I see around me are the things that I'm trying to be a part of. The understanding I have at that time, which again is not necessarily conscious, is that I need to do these things or I'll be alone.
That's right.
Or I will be perceived as separate from or different from. And so I think most people are subject to trying to be normal.
That's right.
Which is represented by what they're seeing in their immediate environment around them.
That's exactly it. And what I'm saying is that attempt to fit in is actually what makes so many of us sick, because it goes contrary to our true nature.
Mm.
So we give up essential aspects of ourselves in order to belong, but in surrendering the self, we're making ourselves ill in body and in mind.
Mm.
The very attempt to be normal is a source of pathology, is what I'm saying.
Mm.
Because if you take your example, so if you explore your example, what about yourself did you give up in order to belong?
Mm. Oh God, so much. I can tell you one story that might answer that question.
Sure.
So in my extended family, there was success in business. Everybody knew it. Even as kids, we understood there's success in business here. There's somewhere in our family, there's there's treasure, and there's been success.
Yeah.
But our family was cut off from it in terms of being able to access wealth or that kind of thing. And so I always felt kind of a little bit like an outsider. Now, there was the family business office. And this place was like daunting and frightening to me as a child. And when you went there, you had to put on a tie.
Okay.
Had to do it, jacket and tie. But I never wore a jacket and tie like my cousins who were in other wings of the family and were brought up sort of within the business, within the family. We were sort of the separate wing of the family. We didn't wear jackets and ties, but they did. And so I didn't know how to tie a tie. So when I went to the office, I was so ashamed of myself. And I felt so wrong because I didn't know how to tie a tie. I was maybe 10 years old and I had never learned how to tie a tie. That's just sort of to show you a little bit of and that, I'm not blaming anybody. That was just my experience.
Yeah.
And so what did I give up? Well, I gave up the exploration of my own heart.
That's right.
To try to figure out, well, Tommy, how would you be? And isn't it okay that you would be how you are?
Yeah.
It would take me many, many, many years of a lot of pain and suffering, a lot of drugs, and a lot of avoidance to come to a place of comfort with me being me.
But that's the whole thing. And the culture, for the most part, demands that we're not ourselves, or that we not be ourselves. Because from the perspective of industrialized society, where most people are expected to do work that means very little to them and over which they have very little say, the more they can give up themselves, the more they can fit into that role. So that Eric Fromm, the social psychologist, wrote about the social self being the self that this society encourages and allows you to have. But that comes at a cost of the real self. And that suppressing the real self then is, in my view, a source of much suffering and pathology. But in a society like this, a materialistic society, where our value is defined by what we consume or what we produce or what we own. In other words, what matters is matter. What matters is the matter that we produce, own, or consume, or purchase. That's what matters.
Did you see, there was a film, I think it's out now, it's called Take Your Pills.
No, I haven't.
It's a Netflix documentary about Adderall.
Okay.
And the Adderall craze in the United States, which is truly it's completely out of control. I get that information not from the documentary, but from younger people that I work with who are in universities, prominent universities in the United States right now, who report back that they don't know anybody in their class who's not at some point engaged in taking Adderall or selling it to other students. In this movie, which just consequently, I think it did a very poor job of expressing some of the dangers. I think it did a very good job, unfortunately, of celebrating it, where they have certain people in the movie who say things like, well, Adderall ought to come with a warning that you can become awesome at everything if you take it. So there's this whole psychology, to the point earlier, if you're around a whole group of people where they're driven to succeed in what they consider to be success, and the way they get there is through taking Adderall, methamphetamines, speed of some form. I can't see this ending in a place that isn't filled with tears, quite frankly.
Well, it's an interesting question because you're talking to somebody who's taken such medications.
Yes.
For my ADD, and
yes,
it genuinely did help me.
Yes.
When I used them for the specific purpose that helped me focus, they helped me with my writing. Actually.
Yes.
I haven't taken them for years, and there's a couple of questions here. One is everybody taking it because they legitimately have a condition that this is indicated for, or are they taking it simply to enhance performance because it's performance oriented? Of course, it also gives you a false sense of purpose and intention and so on. So it can just become another addictive drug for sure.
Yes. Then
the second question is, why are so many more people being diagnosed with ADHD than used to be? And is there something that's just an overdiagnosis, or is it that legitimately more people are impaired somehow in their capacity to focus and to stay tuned in? And I'd say that it's all of those things. We're overdiagnosing it, but I think there's also more people who are genuinely challenged. And that's another feature of the pathogenic nature of our society, and that when you look at something like ADD, which I did in my first book, the Canadian title is Scattered Minds, the American title is Scattered. What I argue in there is that it's not a disease that you inherit. In fact, it's not a disease at all. I may have talked about this already at some point, but it's the tuning out is actually a defense against overwhelming stress. And so when infants are stressed, one of the only things they know how to do is to tune out because the stress is too much. But this is happening when the brain is developing, when the dopamine circuits and all the other important circuits are developing. So the question is, what's happening in the society that infants are so stressed, that so many of them are having to tune out when their brain is developing? Well, what's happening is that the parents are so stressed. And so that's another nature in which another way in which this society makes people ill is that it creates stresses on the parenting environment, which then gets translated into the maldevelopment of so many people's brains. A story. Somebody in Vancouver, where I live, was organizing a TED-type event. And they want to invite a couple of thousand people, and they want to be one of the speakers at their first such event. And they said, well, I used to work with TED, and TED takes about 18 minutes. But we find that that's too long for the attention span. So we're going to make it 15 minutes. And I said, what's going on here? It is a fact that this society is generating brains that have less attention capacity than brains 1,000 years ago. We don't have the same brains. Now, there's a reason for that. And the reason is all the stress. And that's another way in which this society is abnormal. So the norm now is less and less an attention span. So some of these kids taking the Adderall, well, they might be legitimate candidates because their brains are so messed up because of the stresses that they had to deal with before they had any choice in the matter.
It doesn't seem, at least from what the film is depicting, it seems that, and to your point, maybe legitimately they actually need it to focus, but it seems like kids are pretty much just taking it because they feel that they're just going to be able to excel in their studies more than if they don't take it.
Yeah, I understand. And it's true. Probably a stimulant will, in the short term, help anybody do better. I used to take a stimulant long before my diagnosis, decades before I was at university. And typically, I'd leave things to the last minute, and I'd take Benzedrine, which is a weight loss pill. I used to work as a delivery boy for a pharmacy. So I had access to stuff. And so I took Benzedrine, and I stay up all night, and I study, and I do well next morning. And then by the afternoon, I forgot what the hell I wrote in the morning on the exam. But and of course, there's also that tremendous pressure on kids to do well, and what it means if they don't do well. So it's social pressure again. I get the point of the film, and it's another sign of a society that is not normal.
I also want to say, first of all, thank you for sharing that. In terms of the your willingness to just express that you've had direct experience with this, with Adderall or a form of speed, and I have not.
Yeah,
So I appreciate that. I also, in the same vein as people falling onto a spectrum, I'm not looking at medication as a black and white situation.
Yeah.
I'm also seeing that there's a time and a place and a relevance. I agree with you that we can all agree that medications are overprescribed, at least in the United States. There's really no question about that. Yeah. But we can also agree that certain people need medication.
Yeah.
For sure. So,
and the question is, from a social point of view, is why is it that either more people need medication or more people think they need medication? That's a sign of social pathology. That's not an individual issue. That's a cultural question.
So, frankly, the word stress, it doesn't quite cover it these days. Because, everything, literally everything, I have felt stressed because I've opened up my email inbox and there's 200 emails in there that I haven't answered. There's like stress there.
And some people feel stressed because they don't get 200 emails, and I'm wondering if anybody loves them.
Yeah. So, these days, the stress is everywhere, and it cuts a swath across every area of our life. We can look at, sexuality, romantic relationships and sexuality. Talk about a world where we're trying to be what we think we're supposed to be with another person based on what we read in a magazine or see in a movie or on the internet.
Well, the New York Times yesterday, or either today or yesterday, had a very interesting feature. They talked about young people, both male and female, and their sexual experiences. and so often they engaged in them, males and females, really feeling uncomfortable, but engaging in it because they thought something was expected of them. So it takes something like sexuality, which is a normal aspect of mammalian or animal life, and certainly human life, but it becomes such a source of stress, and which has everything to do with how we are made to feel about ourselves and our bodies, and how we're also disabled in our approach to relationship. Now again, that's cultural. It's not an individual problem. It's a cultural phenomenon. When it's so massive.
Yes.
So women are not saying no because they're afraid to seem. Well, maybe the guys are going along with stuff sometimes because they want to look natural. They don't want to look weak. And how many of us, if we actually examine ourselves, have really healthy sex lives where we're present and full of joy and gratitude that we experience without anxiety and without conflict. And then what is that a sign of? It's not in our nature to be that way.
There are a number of people now, actually in increasing numbers, who show up on our retreats, a Recovery 2.0 retreat, who, and it's not just men, women as well, who very boldly and honestly, they'll say, I struggle with sex addiction. That's their thing, and I'm working on that. And some of them report that because of the messaging around sex and sexuality, and also the images that they themselves have looked at through pornography, internet pornography, that they have lost the ability to relate and to be excited by another human being.
Yeah, I understand that one.
That somehow it just doesn't.
So what is that a sign of? That's a sign of being disconnected from ourselves, disconnected from our bodies. Which is, to me, is the essence of trauma. That disconnect from the self is the essence of trauma. And one of the things I want to talk about in this book is what trauma is, and trauma is not what happens to us. Trauma is what happens inside us as a result of what happens to us. And the prime thing that happens is that disconnect from the self, which then shows up in a whole lot of areas, including that of sexuality. Now, interestingly enough, are you aware that sex addiction is not acknowledged in the DSM?
Yes, I am aware. And
internet addiction is, but sex addiction is not, which just goes to show you how to touch the medical mindset is with reality. It's a genuine addiction that actually afflicts and disables almost a lot of people. It creates terrible suffering. It's what every feature of addiction.
Yes. Well, they thought about writing it in, but they didn't want to admit it.
So you wonder what the heck is that about?
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
which again speaks to the limitations of the medical model, which deals with abstract criteria rather than real human experience. Because from the aspect of real human experience, sexual addiction is a huge problem for a lot of people. But again, it's because it's not recognized in the DSM. Therefore, you can't have it. You can't have something that doesn't exist. And no matter how really abnormal it is in terms of your own functioning and in terms of your own humanity.
Can you, for people who are not familiar, can you unpack trauma a little bit for folks, how you look at it, a definition, and sort of, what is and what isn't trauma or traumatic?
Sure. So we often think of trauma as something bad that happens to us, something negative that happens to us, like being sexually abused or physically abused or neglected or loss of somebody close to you, or violence in the family. People often think of trauma as the bad stuff that happens to us, like physical, sexual, emotional abuse and loss of somebody close to you, tsunami. And in fact, that's how the medical definition of trauma goes, is bad stuff that happens to people. But that's not what trauma is. Trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result. So what trauma does is it disconnects you from yourself. And why does it do that? Because when you're small and helpless, then you don't have the capacity to alter the situation that's hurting you. You can't leave it and you can't change it. Therefore, how do you deal with it? You disconnect. You disconnect from your body and you disconnect from your emotions. You do that because it's unbearable. And you don't do it, actually. It's an automatic process. It's not like you decide to do it. And so then there's that disconnect happens. Trauma also shapes your view of the world so that you're born into the world. Most of us are born into the world open and trusting of the environment, expecting to receive what we need. That's how we're born. So that we have an open, accepting, and benign sense of this world. Trauma limits that view so that your view of the world becomes constricted, that the world is maybe dangerous, you can't trust it. The world is horrible. I don't know if I mentioned this in a previous conversation with you, but there's a very prominent man who said that the world is a horrible place. If you believe that the world is a horrible place, then you're going to want to be as powerful as you can be, as aggressive as you can be, as selfish as you can be, as suspicious, mistrustful, and you're going to want to be intimidating to other people. Well, the man who said that the world is a horrible place is the President of the United States right now. And those are his words, verbatim. So that's the world that he lives in. And you know why? Because that was his childhood. And so that trauma then actually creates the world that you live in. And then that's the world that you exist in. And if that's the world you live in, you're going to have to be a certain way. So it disconnects you from yourself. It creates a restricted, more dangerous sense of the world. It interferes with your capacity to connect with other people because, of course, you've been hurt. Therefore, it's dangerous to connect in an intimate, open, vulnerable way. And finally, it makes it hard for you to be in the present moment because the present moment was so painful. You always either projecting to the future, like Eckhart Tolle says, or you're living from the past. So when something happens and you react to it, you're not reacting to the present moment, you're reacting to your interpretation of the present moment, which is based on your past experience. So you're not actually present. So disconnection from the self, restricted view of the world, limited capacity to engage in a relationship, difficult to be in the present moment. That's on a psychological level. And on the physiological level, trauma actually interferes with normal brain development. So that the circuits of the brain that get activated in addiction, which we talked about before, the opiate circuits and the dopamine circuits and self-regulation circuits, they don't develop properly under conditions of trauma. So trauma then is not what happened to you externally, but what happened inside you as a result, and which is actually good news for the obvious reason that if the trauma was what happened to you, that'll never unhappen. Like whatever happened to you as a kid or whatever happened to me, it happened. But if the trauma is what happened inside of us, and it has to do with our relationship to ourselves and to the world and to our bodies, well, that we can transform. So that's what trauma actually is.
Thank you. Right now, we're seeing an extremely large number of people engage in the practice of smoking or eating marijuana.
Yeah.
When I used to smoke pot and I've written very openly and clearly about it, that it was, for me, it was really a love affair for many years, until it stopped being a love affair. I used to say I would much rather somebody smoke marijuana than drink alcohol. I'd much rather marijuana be legal than alcohol, because alcohol, for a lot of reasons, but number one, I mean, we're all very clear that alcohol leads to, in many cases, violent behavior and some really unsavory outcomes.
Absolutely.
So in Canada right now, I think you have to help me. I'm not exactly sure where we're at in the process, but marijuana is, certainly the country's moving towards legalizing marijuana for recreational use across the board, I think.
Yes, they are.
And I think
this is the case in California, no?
In California and certain states, I was going to say the United States is lagging behind a little bit, but eventually I can't see that it wouldn't ultimately be legal here, if for no other reason than because of the unbelievable amount of tax revenue that state and the federal government can derive from that, from the sale of it. Just wondering though, if you have any perspective on sort of the treatment of trauma through the use of marijuana. Where's the relevance? And obviously we're not talking about people who consider themselves to be addicts or struggle with, but we're talking about having a broad perspective, an open-minded perspective, not a black and white perspective. If we really want to understand the benefits of marijuana versus the costs to the individual of engaging in that short and long term, I'd like to have just an open conversation about that.
Sure. Now, first of all, from the perspective of this book of mine that we're discussing, Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, said at some point in one of his books that if people weren't consuming so many substances, including marijuana, there'd be much more violence and aggression in our society. In other words, like on a social level, you really have to ask, why are so many people having to do something to alter their states of consciousness? I mean, that's it. I don't care what anybody says about how good they feel with marijuana or what it does for them. You still have to ask, well, why is it that so many human beings are driven to have to escape their ordinary states of mind?
Yes.
For whatever reason. That can't be right. That can't be normal from the broad human perspective. Having said that, I also agree with you that it's far less noxious physiologically to the body, and far less inciting of harmful behavior than the legal portions of alcohol. There's no question, there's no comparison. Absolutely no comparison. And from a physical health point of view, if you take 100 people who smoke even heavily, it's marijuana, or ingested in some other way for 30 years and compare them to 100, same number of people who drink, who's going to be sick and dead? I mean, by far, it's going to be the alcohol group. So from that point, there's no debate whatsoever. In Canada, there's an interesting example of veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder who have been using a lot of marijuana to treat the symptoms, and as a result, they're using fewer opiates. So that should replace their opiate dependence with a marijuana dependence. It's actually helping them deal with their symptoms. Is that a good thing? Yeah, that's a good thing. It's less disabling than the opiates are, and it's less likely to lead to overdose and disease and so on.
Yes.
Having said that, it also points to the failure of our treatment of PTSD, because why is it that we can't heal these people? That all we can still do is symptom control. So while in itself, I say, well, if you got PTSD and if you got to use marijuana to keep yourself from suffering, do it. But I say there's more to treating PTSD and than just treating symptoms.
Yes.
So I'm not arguing with somebody who feel the need to use it. I would say to them that is a sign of where we're at medically or psychologically in terms of our capacity to understand PTSD and to deal with it. It just shows you how inept we are and how deficient our understanding is. So that,
yes.
In terms of people using marijuana spiritually, I know people who do it. I haven't. I can see the possibility. I haven't explored that for myself. But some people, they have ceremonies and they go deep, and I don't know what to say about that. I can't argue with somebody else's experience when I haven't explored that experience. I also know, however, I've seen a lot of people who think they're using marijuana benignly without any negative effect, but I think they're having a negative effect. I think they're further away from themselves, and I think they're not dealing with stuff in their lives, and they're really something. So,
yes,
again, it's a multifaceted thing.
Yeah, it's a spectrum, and I'm for myself. I'm training myself out of black and white thinking. I'm trying to bring more awareness to it in my approach to people on the topics of harm reduction, and understanding that different people need different things at different times. And I certainly look at my own experience, and there was a time when I think I would have gone out of my mind as a teenager if I hadn't found marijuana, and there was a relevance to it.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there's another teacher of mine in India. When we go, we have these kinds of conversations pretty much all the time. And he said, if it's on the planet, there's a relevance to it. It's a question of when and where and who.
Yeah.
But he also says, if you really, really want to meet yourself, and you really want to connect with authentic, true self, it's going to be very difficult if you're engaged in taking drugs on a regular basis. Yeah. These are his words, and I can reflect that through my own experience, that I certainly made a lot more progress in my life after the period of pain management. That's what I'd call it, the pain management period of my life, through chemicals anyway.
Well, again, it comes down to whether are you using it as an escape or using it as a connection. And, substances can be, you and I have talked about this before, substances can be double-edged that way. So there's certain substances you can certainly use to connect deeply with yourself. But at the same time, you can also use substances, as most people do, to escape from themselves. So it is where and with and where and with whom and with what intention. But again, the social question is, why is this such a big issue? Like, why do hundreds of thousands of people feel that they have to use something on a fairly regular basis? I mean, that speaks to something about this culture. We're so uneasy with ourselves. Like, why can't we relax? Why can't we be ourselves? Why can't we enjoy ourselves? Why can't we essentially be alive without the substance in our bodies?
It makes me think how important the practices of mindfulness, meditation, yoga are at this moment in time, to try to bring people back around. At least there's a modality that I can advocate for and use in my own life. That it really, Gabor, if I'm stressed out and I step onto a yoga mat for either my own practice or I go with a teacher, in 60 minutes of breathing and paying attention, I really can say almost without fail, I'm in such a better place, just like that. And obviously I talk about this stuff all day long to people, but it's very quick. There is a solution that I don't think we're necessarily exploring.
Well, as I think so in the last year and a half, I've actually developed a yoga practice, but I haven't done it for 3 days now. The decisions I've made in my life is to, what to do and what not to do.
Sure.
I feel the difference.
Yes.
I'm definitely more irritable today, and less tolerant, and less present, and all because of choices that I made that I'm going to be more out there than in here. And I haven't yoga, so I could certainly attest to the truth of what you're talking about, which is another feature of this culture of ours, that it keeps us so externally oriented, and the siren call of being externally oriented of what others are doing, rather than honoring the self. And I even have a sense of grief as I talk about it, just grief over the last 3 days that I haven't, and maybe I won't even do today because I look at my schedule for today, everything I'm doing is good. You know, I went for a walk with a friend, and I talked to my book agent, and I'm talking with you. And I'm going to visit a friend of mine who's physically disabled, and then I'm interviewing somebody for their launch of their new novel and
Yes.
stuff. But where am I in the middle of all that?
Hmm.
You know? And that's
Well,
the big thing about our society is we abandon ourselves.
I'm going to send you a video
Okay.
right after this, and it's just me practicing like a 15-minute yoga set that you and I can do together tomorrow morning.
Oh, that'd be great.
If not today, just tomorrow, 15 minutes, boom. And that's my antidote to what we're talking about.
I love that, you know, because the routine that I've learned is about 45, 50 minutes.
Yes.
And that's what I have difficulty sometimes finding the time, or at least finding the time for, or assigning the time to.
Me too.
Give you something 15 minutes, that seems doable.
Yes. Yes, I have to, in terms of just a strategy for making a toxic life untoxic or less toxic, I have to set myself up for success. And I can bemoan the fact that I don't go to the gym unless I pay a trainer to meet me there. Or I actually have the money, so I could pay a trainer and just go to the gym and feel great, and it's not a problem.
Yeah.
I need that.
I mean, actually, I'll be one of the things I want to do when I write this book is to interview you. Because the subtitle of the book is Pathways to Healing in an Insane Culture, or Pathways to Health. And you've certainly embodied a certain pathway to health. You teach a lot of people how to do it. Let me tell you one more feature about this society, though, that I'd like to touch upon. So there was a study last year that showed that the more experiences of racism a Black woman has to endure, the greater risk of asthma.
Of asthma?
Yeah. And what I'm saying is that now, when you look at asthma, it's an inflammation of the airways and a narrowing of the airways. It's a physiological event. You think, what's that got to do with racism? But when you actually look at how we treat asthma, it's with adrenaline and cortisol, which are the stress hormones. Adrenaline opens up the airways, and the cortisol suppresses the inflammation. So that clearly tells us that stress has a lot to do with the pathway that leads to asthma. And the question I'm asking is the airway inflammation and narrowed air tubes of that Black woman her pathology, or is it a social pathology? Does it reflect an abnormal culture? I say abnormal in the sense, again, of genuine human needs, human nature. And so I'm saying that there's so many ways in which, now that's just one particular example. And if you look at the rates of asthma and allergies, it's going up and up and up in the society. And surely some of the reason has to do with the pollution and who knows what in the environment, for sure, which itself is a sign of abnormality. That amidst all its wealth, we can't clear up the environment because we're so committed to more wealth. But it's also a sign of the stress that the society puts people under. So that stress is affecting their immune system and even their capacity to breathe. You know, so this is a society that's profoundly abnormal when it comes to, profoundly insane when it comes to comparing it to a genuine human need and human nature. And healing or health has to do with actually finding a way to resist the cultural teachings and the cultural pedagogy, which is crazy because culture should be here to make us healthier. So we're at the point of civilization now where we have to fight the culture in order to be healthy. Like another fact that came across my desk 3 weeks ago, as globalization enters more and more societies and cultures, the rate of inflammatory bowel disease is increasing across the world. So societies that didn't used to have bowel inflammation like Crohn's and colitis are now finding a higher incidence of it. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's not just a physical thing. It has to do with the disconnection and the stress that this particular culture he imposes on people. So that really what I'm looking at is a very broad question of what is it about this wealthy, profoundly wealthy and profoundly unhealthy culture.
Mm.
You know, and so that's the exploration I'm embarking on. I don't want anybody to get too excited about the book because I'm just starting to write it. So don't look for it yet. but that's the inquiry I'll be conducting over the next year or so.
Yes, and there obviously there has to be a connection or an exacerbation of a social issue through the dietary choices one makes under stress.
It's a manifestation. Yeah, absolutely. And the more stressed you are, like when we talk about this obesity epidemic, you know, it's spreading around the world now. Countries that never used to have obesity have it now. In China, it's a huge problem now. In Mexico, it's a huge problem. In fact, in Mexico, the rate is higher than even in the US. In Mexico, it's so bad that every 38 minutes, somebody there is diagnosed with diabetes, apparently. And this is a society that used to be not wealthy, but used to eat very well. And this is a manifestation of globalized capitalism. You know, and if you actually, the New York Times did a huge series of articles on the spreading of obesity in the world, and Africa and Latin America, the big international corporations are just getting in there and making sure that people are eating more sugar and more fat.
Oh yeah.
This is not a spontaneous phenomenon. I mean, when people are stressed, they'll go to those foods, but it's also propagated by very conscious people. When I say conscious of profit.
Yes. Premeditated.
Premeditated. Yeah.
Well, Gabor, if there were anyone on this planet meant to help shed a light on this topic and help to start to get people to turn it around, it would be you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for doing it. And obviously, in any way that we can ever support you, and when that book is anywhere near, you know, ready, we'll send the whole community to get it for sure.
And I'll be talking to you about it again, because I want to, having read your book and written the preface for it, I know that you have plenty to say that'll be of relevance to this topic.
Well, thank you so much, and so much love to you, and I can't wait to connect with you somewhere down the road, hopefully soon.
Likewise. Take care, Tommy.
Okay, take good care.